Welcome back to the Liberating Yoga Podcast, a space to explore yoga as a practice and a path of healing, resistance, and deep connection. My name is Harpinder Mann. I'm a yoga educator, a writer, a seeker, here to dive into the roots of yoga, dismantle appropriation, and uplift practices that honor collective liberation while making yoga truly accessible. All of these conversations were recorded 2 years ago as a part of my research and interviews for my book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. Now I'm bringing them to you, unedited and in full, to continue the dialogue on how we can honor yoga's past while shaping its future. There is no checklist for avoiding cultural appropriation and honoring yoga's roots. In a society seeking quick fixes to avoid being wrong, this episode is an invitation to think more deeply about how we might connect back to the path's original intentions with reverence. I sit down with Dr. Dalal, researcher and director of religious studies at the University of Alberta, to explore what it might look like to practice yoga deeply and to decolonize this path. Let's get into it. I am so excited to be chatting with Dr. Dalal, with Neil, and we're going to hop straight into the first question on what does yoga mean to you?
Oh, well, to me personally, you mean, like individually? For me personally, there's a lot of ways, right, to look at it. But I think for me, it's, first of all, it's a internal inquiry, looking at myself. And this can have a broad range, right? Like in a posture practice, you can be really exploring your body mindfully, etc. But then I think there's all these deeper aspects, which for me are profound, of looking like, what is the nature of my subjectivity? What is the nature of my self-identity? And ultimately, then it's an exploration of what is mind and what is consciousness, under like expressing through the mind. So I'd say that is the principal core of yoga for me. And then along the way, or in the wake of that inquiry, come all the different practices, specifically meditation and reflexive practices and contemplative practices, so forth and so on. That's my quick, in a nutshell, answer.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I know in a longer course that I took that you had called Decolonial Yoga, you talked a lot about yoga being that self-inquiry and looking at who am I, what is the nature of reality, what is consciousness. And I know when I first found my way to yoga, that's what I thought I was going to be exploring. Like I was 19 at that time, just confused, like what is my purpose for being alive? What is the meaning of life? I came to yoga thinking like, oh, it's going to help me answer these questions. And what I found was an exercise class. And I was like, oh, this isn't what I thought this is going to be. So I feel really appreciative now over the last many years of studying, finding teachers that know of yoga to be this and study it that way and teach it that way. And I also appreciated taking your course and learning it that way as this deeper inquiry, that exploration of also what is our mind, what is the nature of our mind, how it operates. So we can move through the world in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all too often lost in the modern yoga scene. So
yeah. So I am appreciative of teachers like yourself, that care about teaching in that way. And for those that most likely you're not going to know, because I don't often talk about this, I'm taking a Bhagavad Gita course with you. And it's been so wonderful to move through each one of the verses and learn at a deeper level, to also like understand how to pronounce each one of the words correctly and take that time to chant it. And that's been really helpful to have that class as well. this kind of goes into my next question of then, with your path of yoga, is there a specific lineage in which you were initiated or you study? What does that look like for you?
So when I was in my early 20s, to go back a little bit, when I was relatively young, like 18, I got into spirituality, and broadly speaking, in many different forms. And it slowly grew and grew on me. And I came to this recognition somehow, it's a longer story, that this idea of oneness or non-duality was really calling me. And I was trying to figure it out. This is internet time. So just trying to figure it out on my own and explore different places and people. And I couldn't really find what I was looking for. And then I moved to San Francisco. I was in California, and I met my first teacher there, who introduced me to Advaita Vedanta. And immediately I was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. So I am traditionally trained in Advaita Vedanta in the classical tradition of Shankaracharya, under Swami Dayananda Saraswati. So he was a renowned teacher of Advaita. He passed away some years ago. But I spent many years in India studying with him and other senior teachers in that lineage. The lineage is Arshavidya Sampradaya. So that's my training primarily.
Mm. And in that training, were you taught like the intentions and goals of yoga in a traditional sense?
Yeah, so I lived in a monastic context, studying with monks and nuns, renouncers, swamis and swaminis, and that is the real foundation of the whole inquiry. Is what you have to be really clear. Traditionally, the ideal is you want to be clear about what is your goal and what is the means. What's the means in the end? What we call the sadhana. Many people know the term sadhana, but the other term is sadhya, the goal of the sadhana, right? And so you don't want to just jump into lots of different sadhana practices without understanding, like, how is this tied to the goal of yogic practice more broadly? And so, yeah, it was very clearly, maybe I put it differently. One doesn't really get into Advaita Vedanta on a deep level without having come to some clarity around the goal in the first place. And that goal is, maybe in the beginning it's a little ambiguous, but some kind of deep freedom, right? Some kind of happiness or freedom or liberation, moksha, if you want to use the most common term. And then in the tradition, you come to a greater and greater understanding of what is moksha, according to this lineage, at least. There's different yogic lineages with different conceptions. But what is moksha? Why is it valuable? How do you approach it? Then you engage with different practices to that knowledge.
I love that pointing to of knowing what your goal or intention is. Because I do find oftentimes a lot of people will go into certain things without necessarily knowing what their intention or goal is. And to have both the practices and the goal of what you're working towards is crucial. It's really important. The question that came up for me is within your lineage, I know you said different lineages have different understandings of moksha. What was that understanding of moksha in your lineage?
First, just to go back to your first point, I think it's so true that there's a lot of confusion around this means and ends, because especially in modern yoga, like you're saying, you came to yoga thinking about what is the purpose of life and so forth and so on. And then when you walk into much of modern yoga, it's such a big, vast world, of course, but there's very different ideals, right? Is it physical health or physical beauty, like aesthetic qualities? Is it, health and wellness, self-care, or is it getting into the more esoteric occult practices, or is it about meditation or about attaining mystical states? Like there's such a gamut. And oftentimes it's sort of like a catch-all be-all. Like you do yoga and all these things are going to come, or only one, and it's not often clarified. So I think the modern world of spirituality in general is confusing for the individual practitioner engaging it, because it's not clear necessarily what you want. It's not clear necessarily what you're being given, or the possibilities of what you're practicing will lead you to. And yeah, it's a little bit like walking through a forest in the dark. So for Advaita Vedanta and this tradition that's coming out of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita primarily, moksha is understanding the truth of yourself. Like, what is the fundamental ground of my reality, of my being, of my sentiency and my experience? And where that takes you is a recognition that I am the reality of all things, that the consciousness that is manifesting through my experience at all times and all my cognition, all my experience is actually non-dual awareness, which underlies all things, including the divine, including seemingly insentient objects, other people, non-human animals. That it's all just this one consciousness. And in the discovery of that, in the wake of that comes with it a fullness, a wholeness, that liberation which we seek.
Yeah, the way that I've also come to understand moksha is the liberation from the cycle of birth, death, rebirth. Is that another understanding of moksha from a different lineage?
Well, that's also included. So I think generally I read this, I think we can approach moksha from different angles, right? So there's a theological angle, which I would put rebirth in, karma, rebirth, or re-death, in terms of samsara. This cycle of rebirth is really more about dying again and suffering again and being free from that process.
Mm-hmm.
We can take a psychological angle, which is liberation in this life, because it's not really about the next life primarily. It's also about, finding freedom here and now, that it's a present possibility at any time. So, and then there's, like, maybe I could say epistemological angles in terms of the practice and the result. So to take a simple example, if I've lost my glasses and I meet someone, like I'm looking all over the house for my glasses, and then, someone, a friend, a child, whoever says, no, your glasses are on your head, right? And now I've found them, and I've found the freedom. I've dismissed the suffering from searching and everywhere for my glasses. So there's a knowledge aspect, right? And then there's a psychological aspect of relief, of discovering what I wanted to discover, etc. But to answer your question, yeah, rebirth is certainly part of that, because in this discovery of non-dual awareness comes a negation of my personal agency, or my self-identity limited to this mind body becomes eliminated in terms of knowledge, not necessarily in terms of experience, but in terms of knowledge. And so with that, from a theological standpoint of karma and rebirth, there's no place to pin karma to, right? It's so that all resolves or dissolves, so that for the liberated person, when their body falls at the time of death, there's no travel to the next birth or to a heavenly world, right?
Yeah, as you were describing, accessing that freedom in the now, in this present life, I was reminded one of the first times I went to India on my own was my second job out of college. And I went to the Ananda ashram, and I was going there pretty much on like a consistent basis for a couple months while I was there. It was like the first or second class. I'm taking a taxi or an Ola back to my hotel. And I just felt this like experiential sense of like, oh, I'm connected to everything. And it felt like in this moment, oh, what I've been searching for my whole life, like I found it. Like it felt like this really big existential experience. And I feel like my life has never been the same since. And I owe going to the Ananda Sangha and like being a part of it and experiencing what I was like, oh, this is what I wanted to learn. Like I wanted to learn what life is and practicing and like being in community. Because I know sometimes when I speak to students or, and I work with like kids and teens, sometimes having that sense of, well, what does it experientially mean to feel interconnected or to access peace or freedom can feel like a foreign thing to folks. Mm-hmm. And I know for myself in different ways, I have accessed that for myself. And I think about just yesterday receiving an email about not having a particular teaching engagement and feeling really angry about it for a couple hours and slowly making my way, just, allow the emotions to be and process through it. And then getting to a point where I was like, well, I have my faith in God, in higher power, and that it's going to be okay. Like, I don't need to be so gripping around attachment. I need to have this, what is it going to mean? And I find in like different everyday life situations, these teachings bring a sense of freedom and peace. Mm-hmm. But sometimes that can feel foreign when there isn't that base level understanding of maybe the philosophy or the understanding of these things or the experiential feeling of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing too that feeling acceptance or at homeness or equanimity can feel foreign. Right? Because on one hand, it feels so natural, right? You feel at home, like in the way that when you see a kind act done, mm-hmm. or you do a kind act or someone does one for you, there's this great sense of value and freedom and love or whatever, is being evoked by that. And when we have, I think when we have experiences on that positive spectrum, it feels at home, right? That experiencing that kind of inner ananda, that inner contentedness or satisfaction feels at homeness. And yet, and when we feel anger, things like that, feels more like foreign thing that we need to get rid of, right? Or eliminate. But it's so interesting that feeling the positive is also alienating because we're not used to it, or we're culturally conditioned not to expect it or to feel guilty about it, whatever it's evoking for the individual. And so, yeah, I think it's really a powerful practice within the Indian yogic philosophies of coming to understand that, being able to contextualize it, being able to access it, and make it a more constant baseline, like a long-term traits, long-term dispositions of the ways we're relating to ourselves and the world. It's a really beautiful aspect of yoga.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a Vipassana meditator, and Goenkaji talks about like anger, and say if you keep meditating, say you're angry about something for 10 days, and then as you keep practicing, then you realize now you're only angry about that thing for 4 days, and like slowly it starts to decrease over time. And I have found that experience for myself where something that would have really bothered me for 4, 5, 6 days, I'm thinking about it. And I know I have learned like silent treatment from my family. That's their way of expressing when they have something they need to say, but they're not going to say it. They're going to give you the silent treatment. And I realized the way I've been conditioned with certain things, with anger, and through practice, a lot of that has weakened where I'm just not like that anymore. And I'm so grateful for these practices for allowing like me to see what is the nature in the way that I behave, move through the world, my mind handles things, sensations that arise, and how can I loosen some of that conditioning? Because it's not actually making me a very grateful or kind or even like kind person to myself. But without these practices, I'm not quite sure where I would have learned any of these things. And I think that's perhaps like a travesty when I think about modern yoga, like practitioner goals, maybe only being focused on like the aesthetic or the physical, where it's like, well, there's so much more. There's so much more depth there that we're missing out on if we're not looking to the philosophy or not looking at even that consistent practice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And this kind of leads into my next question. And I know we talked a little bit in your lineage what the goals are, the traditional goals. How do you see that as being similar or different to the goals in modern yoga?
Well, I guess it's always a little confusing to me, like, what are the goals of modern yoga? Not confusing. I think it's there's a lot of ambiguity, and it's all over the place, depending on context and lineage and individual. Because we're also living in this modern yoga is contextualized in the world of modern spirituality, in which the individual really has this personal agency to create their own spirituality, which is beautiful in many ways, but it's also so relativistic to the individual, right? So whatever one wants becomes their yoga goals, right? So if you want to be beautiful, or you want to have a following, or you want media presence, right? All these kind of contemporary things are coming up, of like including selling, branding yourself as a yoga person, or status. Like, so there's, I mean, that kind of sounds kind of critical, but that's tied in. I think the majority of people doing yoga it's for physical wellness and some kind of, self-care. And I think those are, I have no problem with those ideals, those goals, just that they're really different than the classical goals. Because I think self-care or wellness is so much more on the health side these days, or on a therapeutic side. And there's a lot of psychological therapeutic aspects of yoga psychology, but it's generally instrumental to something more, right? It's not an end in itself. So, yeah, I think of course there are certain contemporary yoga lineages or groups, communities that are, pushing towards something that they'd identify as moksha, but on the majority bulk level of practitioners, the goals are simply very different. The practices and the goals, like we have something very, very different and new, even if it's has some continuities and it's evolved in certain ways from pre-modern or classical yoga systems. It is something distinctly modern in terms of practice and methods and goals.
This might be a big question, but why do you think that is?
That is a big question. Well, I think, historically speaking, we have a really fascinating encounter between South Asia and, I don't like to use the word West, but, European colonial powers, put it that way, right? And in that, there's so many changes to modern Hinduism, and there's so many changes into modern yoga. And then as yoga transitions into Europe and North America, it's undergoing a whole new set of changes. And so it's plastic and moldable, and it's also hybridic. So it's taking, modern yoga, even in India, from the early 20th century onwards, before it became a global phenomenon, it's already shifting and changing. It's being secularized in certain parts. It's being medicalized by certain people or certain areas. It's being universalized in certain ways. It's in some cases being stripped of its religious, philosophical types of goals and practices. And so there's all these shifts. And then when we look at it in the North American context, we also have the privatization of religion, for example, coming out, which is partly tied to secularization and then commodification and capitalism. And so we have this really interesting, mix of political and economic and also the rise of new age movements, what we call the American metaphysical traditions, specifically in the 19th century, shifting our whole modern view of yoga. And so a lot of what we find is this hybridized version, but as it moves forward, it keeps getting stripped more and more of the classical aspects or the Indian aspects. And so we have something that is, I think, much more distinctly a new age phenomenon, or something that's been secularized into just a physical regimen.
Yeah, I feel like what I'm hearing in that is there's just so many different factors and different systemic things that have resulted in yoga being what it is now. What's I don't know if this is the right word, like danger or consequence, or like what gets lost in yoga being how it's taught now and perceived now?
Well, I think many classical yoga traditions are still alive and flourishing. A lot has been lost, but you still have, let's say, in my case, traditional Advaita Vedanta is very much alive, and especially in India. I do think, looking at the North American context, the whole view of yoga is changing, right? And so, to what degree if we're talking about the danger of, is this an issue of preservation? There are issues. I think maybe another angle to think about it is what is simply being lost for modern yoga practitioners in the process. And the possibilities of their practice, I think, are incredibly stunted, because either the deeper possibilities they're unaware of, or there's a scarcity of teachers who can engage that in a way that is a living tradition. Not just saying, well, this is the history of yoga, or this is what such and such text says, like in a sort of academic way. Or oftentimes stuff is being, classical like you take the Bhagavad Gita, for example, or the Yoga Sutras. It's being read in completely new ways, which, from my perspective, is a distortion of the text's actual intentions. And so, if this is a misreading or misapprehension, and then, in terms of the individual yoga practitioners, it causes confusion or spiritual plateaus, or going down sort of paths that the classical tradition would consider incorrect. So I think that there's issues in terms of the cultural traditions. So if we going to like cultural appropriation, and what does it mean for these traditions and how are they affected? There's potentially issues for like diaspora South Asians, of whatever, let's say in this case Hindus or Buddhists, for example, and how their traditions are being reshaped in the modern yoga scene and then taken up in those communities that way, potentially. There's issues around desacralizing the traditions or symbols or deities or various cultural forms or cultural artifacts. So there's in many ways we can talk about problematic aspects from a moral standpoint.
As you were talking, it reminded me, I attended a yoga conference last year, and I was really excited to go to this session on yogic philosophy and how to integrate it into your classes. And it was taught by a white woman who leads 300-hour advanced teacher trainings. And I go sit down, I'm really excited. She starts us off with an asana practice, and then we start learning. She gives us handouts. And her main thesis was students love learning philosophy, and the way that you can teach it is just pick up like a Yoga Sutra translation and commentary, or Bhagavad Gita translation and commentary, read it for yourself, interpret it, and then teach it. And I just remember sitting there and I was just like, what? Like, we get told, if you want to teach asana, take this training, take that training, learn about biomechanics and anatomy. And I was like, and here you are telling students, if they want to teach philosophy, just pick up any book, interpret it as you see fit, and then teach it at the beginning of your class. And she was giving examples of how her students love it, and she gets more students that come back. And I just remember sitting there, I was like, I want to raise my hand so badly and say, I disagree. I think you should be telling students, go find a teacher. Go find a teacher to help you learn, to study it, and then maybe you can bring it into class. I didn't say anything, though. I just remember just walking away. I'm just like, what was that? There's 35 people in there learning from what we all think is a steeped teacher who teaches 300-hour advanced teacher trainings. And this is the advice that's being given out. And I think that also leads to that like dilution and distortion, where we're just picking up books. And like, I have my worldview being raised in North America. Like I have, and luckily I was raised in a Punjabi Sikh family, so I have the base level understanding. But for folks that have a completely different worldview, you're going to place your interpretation on that text and teach it from that place. And it could potentially be wrong. And I just walked out, just shaking my head. And I was like, I should have said something. I did not though.
Yeah, and that's a very common view. I've come across it many times as well. Sometimes in esoteric ways, where people will claim, I can read a verse in Sanskrit, not even an English translation, and my spirit guides or angels will tell me the meaning. Right? This is like an occult interpretation. It comes out of, we have a historical genealogy for these sorts of approaches, like from the Theosophical Society. Right? So it's not a new thing. It's actually a relatively old, at least a century old, that kind of approach. And that's an interesting example, actually, of the ways that American metaphysical traditions or occult traditions have influenced modern yoga in ways that are completely not like what you would find in the tradition. Because, of course, in the tradition, it's such a big responsibility to transfer the tradition with proper accuracy, whether it's from the ground of just chanting Vedas properly, right? But then when we talk about, let's say, the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutras, which are the two most important texts in modern yoga's approach to classical yoga, whether or not that should be accurate or not, but and most people are reading translations, which I do an interesting project in my, I teach a course on modern yoga at my university, and I'll have students take the earliest commentary by Vyasa, which is considered the most important commentary in the Yoga Sutras, and then to take a modern interpretation. And they cannot even map the two commentaries onto each other. They're so different. So exactly what you're saying is right. Like, there's this ideology. It's part of the anti-intellectualism and the anti-traditionalism, view it as dogma, that any classical interpretation is dogmatic. And it's also kind of laziness. Mm. And it also speaks to the lack of teachers who can actually teach. And then people who have authority creating this assumption that you can just do this and it's fine. And it's going to work. And it's going to get positive feedback because students like that. They feel empowered to do it on their own. The interpretations are usually going to be some feel-good type of thing that students come in and feel good, right? Like it's like a little positive thing in their day. Whereas just a side note that, the yoga traditions don't shy away from things that don't make you feel good either. There's a little bit of that cult of positivity that has influenced a big part of modern yoga that is not the same. But yeah, so, I spent years and years training academically and traditionally, and like learning Sanskrit and this and that. And I didn't feel comfortable teaching. Even when my teacher gave me permission to teach, I was still like, oh gosh. And even, you take these Gita classes, but I spend a lot of time preparing and thinking through and reading the commentaries and studying. And we only, we only do like 1 to 3 verses in an hour, right? That's the speed and the depth of the traditional teaching. So, yeah, it's unfortunate and it's kind of saddening that assumption is there. And you're absolutely right. I was thinking the same thing, that, people go so into such granular detail in their asana practice and do trainings and anatomy trainings and this training and that training. And it's just proliferation of different trainings you can do for the bodily aspect. And then when it comes to, I've had situations where I've done a teacher training and given like one talk on the Bhagavad Gita, and I've come across a student from that, who I'm pretty sure has no other background, doing posts on social media or blogging or in the earlier days about, this is how we interpret the Bhagavad Gita, this verse or that verse. And how do you do that? So this is also part of, there's a bigger issue here also to go into like a touchy topic of white ownership tied to cultural appropriation. This assumption that yoga's mine or not owned by anyone, therefore I can de facto own it, interpret it, and instrumentalize it in whatever way is going to facilitate my personal goals. This I have a pet peeve about this because I spend so much time trying to figure out texts. I'm like, how can you even just figure out from a translation in the first place? Like, you're already half gone if you don't know Sanskrit, trying to read a Sanskrit text. So
it's really fascinating, because I think for me it also speaks to when people come into yoga teacher trainings, come in wanting to be a yoga teacher. And I'm like, it takes so long to understand, reflect, integrate, unlearn so much of this stuff, that it's like to take a 200-hour training, think you know everything, start teaching all these things. And a lot of the yoga teacher trainings have whole like modules on the business of being a yoga teacher. And oftentimes, and in the research for the book, those like modules are longer than the discussion on the philosophy and the history. And I think it's just the way that folks are being taught and it's being passed down to them, where it's like, oh, it's mine now and I get to do with it as I want because I have the certificate. And even for myself, I have times where I'm just like, what am I teaching? I think I need to pause. I need to like go back and be a student more. And I found myself for the last 6-7 months, especially with writing the book, just taking a lot of pauses from teaching. And as I learn more, I'm just like, wow, how much I don't know. And there's just like, so even in my studying for the last 10, 11 years, I am just like boggled by just touching the tip of the iceberg. And there's just like so much more. And it is interesting, that conversation of white ownership, where it does sometimes feel like, oh, I did this 200-hour training. Now I'm the expert. And now I get to say whatever I want, teach it how I want. And I have considered myself an expert. And it is very triggering. It is very triggering to see these things.
Yeah, or even if people still consider themselves not an expert, they have the platform and the credentials to position themselves as an expert, to present themselves as an authority. I don't think you're certainly an authority in asana practice after a 200-hour training. or 500-hour training. It's bizarre to me because it all makes sense to me from an economic standpoint. I understand why it's happened. Teacher trainings are the cash cow for yoga studios. Yoga studios are always in a tough time, especially the non-corporate chain yoga studios. And then as a yoga teacher, you're in an oversaturated market. You got to do everything you can. I don't even understand how people make a career out of yoga teaching unless they have a big name or a huge social media following. And so you need to do everything you can to brand market yourself in a way that you're going to stand out and get people in your classes and all that. So that it makes sense, but it's so deeply problematic. And the example that always comes up into my mind is as I think about a martial art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For those people who are aware of that, like to get a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, traditionally at least, is a huge, huge endeavor with many, many years of training, every day, so forth. So maybe it takes 10 years, right, of dedicated practice to get that black belt. Whereas a 200-hour teacher training is kind of like getting your black belt in 200 hours, right? Giving you the authority to teach, to get your Yoga Alliance credential, whatever all goes into that whole process. So yeah, it's really washed out yoga, I think, because there's no standards. And now, as you're saying, like I just came across a teacher training recently which had nothing about philosophy. Most of the time it was like, how do you brand? How do you create a social media profile? Obviously all the practicality. How do you run a studio? So now it's, how do you do that? What are business ethics, et cetera? And there's really no space at all for philosophy then. And I don't know what percentage of people are actually, it's sort of fueling, it's a reciprocal cycle, because I think there's this elimination of philosophy. I don't even like the word philosophy, like self-reflection, maybe but also the use of reason and logic. Meditation has been pulled out of yoga and it's only come back in as mindfulness, which is also a bizarre situation because it's not necessarily yogic meditation anymore. It's just modern secularized mindfulness, which is not also arguably very, very different than classical Buddhist meditation. And so, yeah, it's progressing in this way that is slowly distancing itself. And yet, these texts come in, like, let's say the Bhagavad Gita, and doing this in the beginning of the class, interpreting it. It piggybacks on the cachet value of this ancient Vedic, ancient yogic ideology, right? This notion, this conceptualization that what we're doing is what the ancients did. And this is what makes it so powerful. And so you can use the text as a way to tap that power moving through you as an authority to the student, right? And so it makes the student feel good. It makes them feel like they're tapping into this ancient tradition. It makes the teacher look like an authority. And it keeps the cycle going. And at the same time, ironically and kind of harmfully, it's actually distancing the student and teacher and modern yoga itself from the classical traditions, right? It's creating this subterfuge that you're actually delving into it, but you're actually in this simulacrum, which has very little to do with it. So.
Yeah, I had been thinking about going to that conference, seeing the teacher teaching in that way. And just a month before, I'd been at an ashram in Mysore, and they had the asana teacher and a philosophy teacher and different people teaching different things. And I asked the asana teacher, the philosophy teacher was talking about karma or talking about something, like, what did he mean? And the asana teachers looked at me, who was just like, why are you asking me? Ask him. And I was laughing about that because I was like, they're kind of owning, this is what I have studied on, so this is what I'm going to teach on. like him being the asana teacher, he was like, why would you ask me? Ask the philosophy teacher, the one that's teaching it. And I really respected that. I respected that owning up of like, I'm not the expert on this. I don't know. Ask that other person. Where I feel here, it's kind of this like hodgepodge of like, I'm going to study a little bit of everything and then I'm going to pretend like I know it all. Where it should just be like, well, I don't know. And maybe I'm in contact with a different teacher who actually really studies this and like go study with them. And I think that would be a better system than either pretending or just like learning a little bit of something and trying to teach it. I just really appreciated that him just looking at me like incredulously, just like, why are you asking me? And I was like, oh, you're right. Now I know.
Yeah, and I think when you're around people who have deeply trained and studied these classical traditions, the amount one doesn't know becomes more apparent, right? But if you're not exposed to people who have studied, I mean, traditionally or academically for that matter, then you wouldn't know, right? So I think once there's exposure, there's more recognition, and there's just simply very little exposure at least in the North American yoga worlds that I'm familiar with.
In that course that I took with you, you covered decolonization and splitting it up into hard decolonization and soft decolonization when we're looking at yoga. Do you mind going into that a little bit for us, what that looks like, especially when we're talking about the way yoga is now and different ways in which maybe it could be practiced with more respect, or what it would look like to actually decolonize yoga?
I don't remember how I was making that, but I'm just thinking about it right now. So first on, I would make a distinction between a couple things. First, we use the word decolonizing. We have to be a little careful because I think on one level, this is really, decolonizing is really more for Indigenous people. I think there's something to recognize there that, like, you know, repatriating Indigenous land, et cetera, like that's decolonizing proper. But there is something similar going on if we can still use this term in the other contexts like yoga. But I would want to just differentiate decolonizing from something like appreciating and respect, right? So respecting yoga, appreciating yoga, honoring yoga's roots, that sort of ideology, that's useful, and it helps undermine cultural appropriation as a corrective measure, but it's not decolonizing. Because I think of decolonizing as changing structure, like changing the structures where there's systemic inequality. And in the case of yoga, it might be more about, so let me just, one other side note. We can also talk about decolonizing in terms of like material cultural artifacts and immaterial cultural artifacts. Right? So decolonizing material artifacts, like if a museum has the remains of an Indigenous community, that they repatriate the remains to the Indigenous community, right? They don't hold them in the museum. When we're talking about immaterial cultural artifacts, like a knowledge system or, you know, sacred narratives or rituals or things like that, we don't have ownership, and they're not of a material way that you can just give them back, right? So some important distinctions there. But now, honoring yoga, appreciating yoga is not changing structures. And another way to think about decolonizing yoga would be recentering Indigenous, South Asian classical epistemes back to the fore, right? So if what we have in modern yoga is really more of a American metaphysical ideologies, occult ideologies, sort of intertwined with some classical yoga ideas, and then, you know, you have an asana practice, which is, you know, undergone so many changes in modern India, but also now undergone so many changes in the past 50 years. To me, I'm not sure where to draw this line between hard and soft, but if we're talking about ownership, which is a problematic discourse, you can't, like, if we're saying hard decolonization would be like giving ownership back to the classical yoga traditions, I don't think that's realistic. I think it's very confusing because, what is real yoga? Give it back to who, where, right? Who's giving back what? Like, there's all these sort of problems. But so I'm thinking more when I'm approaching this in terms of like teaching and doing workshops and working with yoga practitioners, I'm thinking more on that softer side of there are real actions to do, like prescriptive actions, like, should you say namaste or not? Or can you diversify the people who are teaching? Can you raise South Asian voices particularly? But then also, this intentional returns, like what are the classical traditions saying? How do we understand the differences? At least to understand, it's not saying that, not prescribing that you should take the classical worldviews, but one should understand the difference of what they're teaching, what they're not teaching. And because I think there's a lot of knowledge. To me, my kind of biggest emphasis is not on what you should do or shouldn't do, but like, what should you know? What understanding can you come to? In terms of the classical traditions, in terms of the politics and power and racial dynamics and all these other things taking place, and in what ways are South Asian communities being excluded? How to make their voices heard? Like there's all these different angles to take place, but one has to understand and appreciate it. I find what's happening all too often is that people just want a list of what do I need to do or not do to be proper, to put it simply, right? It's like, okay, I'm not going to say namaste anymore, or I'm going to pronounce this word correctly, that kind of stuff. Or I won't wear a bindi on my forehead, or maybe I'll avoid getting a tattoo of a yoga sutra on my leg or something. But to me, that's just sort of performative and important, but it's sort of empty. I feel like people actually have to understand more.
And I feel like I come across a lot of those folks that are looking for a checklist. I lead a dismantling cultural appropriation workshop for a yoga studio twice a year. And the questions are always like, so can I use Sanskrit in class? Can I end my class with namaste? And I taught at Lightning in a Bottle a couple weeks ago, and we did a decolonizing yoga panel. And even then the questions were like, one person like, can I end my class with namaste? And like, there's a panel of 3 South Asian women, and we all had different answers. And no one was like, no, you can't. It was just like, well, if your intention is pure and you really know why you're doing it, like, go for it. But also, like, here's the way that namaste in different communities is used. And there was just more like reflection behind it. There was more like conversation behind it, just like besides yes or no. And it's like, and I think it goes back to that self-inquiry of like, you need to put a little bit of thought into it. Like, it's not just I hand you a checklist and you're just like, yep, got it, perfect. I go back to doing whatever I've been doing. It's like, sit down, self-reflect, self-inquire, and also look at the histories. Why are things the way that they are? And having that understanding also of like how each one of our own like privilege and power come into these situations. And I think it is just such a like deeper question.
The prescriptions are important. And as a yoga teacher, people are trying to figure out, how should I lead the class, right? What's the best way to do it? And so it's totally understandable. I do think it's not about intention, though. I don't think intention is the pivot on this, because intention doesn't minimize impact, right? So I take it for granted that the vast majority of yoga practitioners, yoga teachers, people who are gatekeeping in yoga are sincere. They have good intentions. I'm charitable that way. But that doesn't mean that they're engaging in a systemic way of doing yoga, teaching yoga, presenting yoga that is not deeply problematic. So like with Namaste, start your class with it. Why end your class with it? Or I don't know, there's lots of ways to take that specific issue, but it's also a lot of catch-22s because, and there are some arguments one could put out that the ways people use like namaste is, or and then pronounce it incorrectly as well, namaste or whatever they pronounce it, that it's a kind of form of mockery of religious words. So it might be deeply problematic in that way. It's not just about saying it at the end incorrectly, because we colloquially and most, at least North Indian dialects, it's used as like a greeting, right? Versus like goodbye. But there is this catch-22 because it's now if you eliminate everything, it's like, okay, I'm not going to say any Sanskrit word, right? I'm not going to say the asana names by their Sanskrit names. I'm not going to this, I'm not going to that. Then the problem on that side is that now how are you honoring yoga's roots in that process too, right? Now you're like stripping it of any kind of Indic, connection where it's more secularized. Or like those yoga studios that even have on their sign, like no Sanskrit here, that kind of.
Oh, wow. I've never seen that.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain yoga communities that have zero interest in the Indian aspect and roots or philosophy or et cetera. They just want to go and do a posture practice. And so they don't want to, they just don't want any of that. So it becomes a selling point for a particular community.
Yeah, I've often thought about that catch-22 of, or like then it's losing any connection. And then it becomes further and further just a exercise class, an exercise program, and it completely just moves away from the true intent. And oftentimes I will hear people saying like, oh, well, asana is an entry point. Folks will make their way to the deeper philosophies or other practices and understandings. But if there's already communities that are no Sanskrit here, who have no connection, I think that's an example of like, well, where are they going to go? They're going to just go and stay at asana.
What I found, I hear that too. And I for a long time, I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? It's a stepping stone. But what I've found, what seems more real to me in my engagement with these communities is that the people who are just focused primarily on asana practice, let's say some kind of spiritualized breath movement practice, right? They're engaging maybe pranayama as well, that they're conditioned to really just think about yoga that way, or yoga's entanglements with kind of modern spiritual new age ideas. And that conditioning to some degree seems to obstruct them from engaging in those deeper aspects. So there's a lot of talk, yamas and niyamas, and then up to samadhi, and like, okay, this is yoga, but we're just doing asana practice. And what I've surprisingly found this quite common, even in those lineages that consider themselves more tied to India, like Iyengar or Ashtanga, Pattabhi Jois Ashtanga, right? Because even in those lineages, Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois didn't teach philosophy, or minimally, right? And so it's always like lurking in the background, even the very name Ashtanga for Joyce's, modern version. But, they explicitly restricted their teaching. I mean, this goes to the teacher Krishnamacharya himself. He's on record saying he was deeply devout, a pundit who had studied deeply in the philosophical traditions. and lived an ascetic life and his lifestyle, etc. But his idea was, how do we universalize this? How do we popularize it? And so, it's partly going back to the 20th century Indian teachers who are also stripping yoga to popularize it. But yeah, I've been surprised that those communities, for example, who will chant mantras occasionally, or like an invocation to start the class or end the class, and they might have an altar with deities. They're much more like Indian centric, and that to be a respected teacher, you should have gone to India, like to the Iyengars in Pune or Mysore to study with the Ashtanga community, like a rite of passage, right? But there's like an appreciation, but a general lack of exposure and a lack of interest, I think, still there in the philosophy, because they're conditioned just to be a hardcore posture practice, So there has to be like a sea change of some sort to come back to that appreciation. I don't know how that would take place, but I don't think the stepping stone ideology is functioning. No.
I had an interview with another South Asian yoga teacher, Tejal, and she made the point of like, well, the people that do say eventually make their way to more of yoga, whatever that might mean, like it wasn't like that person was going to find their way anyways. Like it was just in that person, like it maybe had nothing to do with that ideology. Well, it is just an entry point to stepping stone, like people will make their way. Like that system, that structure isn't set up so people are going to make their way. It's just those people that do happen to make their way, that person was going to make their way anyways. Like it has nothing to do with that ideology. It's just like an entry point, and like people will make their way. And I was thinking about that for my own example of, I was intentionally looking for wanting yoga as a way to deeply understand myself and not as exercise. So did I find my way first to those studios and I was like, what is this? And then kept looking till I found something? Yes. But I think there are people that will go to those studios and then they think like, oh, well, this is what yoga is. And they just stay there. And it isn't a deeper exploration or finding to find what it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that they'll make their way idea, like it's kind of like a karmic theory that they're destined to find it, or that they pursued it in their past life, and so there's this openness and desire that, and when you seek the teacher will come, etc. There's something to be said about that for sure, and but I think it takes it takes so much work in modern yoga to do that, right? Because you're searching, and then everyone's claiming they're that authority, or it's easy to find the people who are claiming they're that authority. And if you don't have the background to understand, I mean, this is the same thing happened to me. Speaking from my own personal experience, I had no idea what was what. And so I was like, oh, this sounds cool. Like, let me study with this person. This sounds cool. Let me do this, and let me go to this workshop or this retreat. And there might be a lot of wonderful things you learn and grow in the process, community you find, and relationships and friendships, and all sorts of wonderful things, ideally. But you're still pressed to find, where do you find it, right? It's like you're in a supermarket of mediocre products. Where do you find the homemade, organic, whatever, to take that illustration to whatever, where that goes. But so I don't disagree with that point, but I think it can turn into like a fatalistic sort of just accept, well, people will find if they need it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and change it, or that we shouldn't, try and forefront those possibilities for people who want it. So I think the people who want it, if they find it, will take it if they're offered it. And the people who don't want it, when they're offered it, won't take it. but the offering has to be there somewhere. Right? Going to India is not a solution either, because it's the same thing. I mean, this sounds critical, but from someone who's classically trained and academically trained, you go to a place like Rishikesh or like some, they're recreating modern yoga there because that's what's going to sell, right? Mm. So people go there and they're like, oh, I'm going to go to India, and they just end up like doing their 200-hour teacher training in India, and it's got a stronger religious element or sacred narrative element, or you're exposed to some rituals and whatnot, or you go bathe in the Ganga River, whatever, but so it's different, but the core content is not necessarily much different. So there's still, still hard to find.
And a lot of those studios in Rishikesh also are like, are 200, 300 hours are Yoga Alliance certified. So they're also basing their standards and training based on what Yoga Alliance has to say, and Yoga Alliance being based in North America. So there is that like sort of cycle that's being created of like, yep, I'm going to go to India to study, but then you're learning the standards that have been set here. And it's all in that effort in the business of becoming a yoga teacher, and not necessarily in deepening your own yoga study. So for those students that are just like, well, I do want to deepen my study and I do want to find something, I'm doing air quotes, like real or authentic, where do they go? What do they do?
I don't know. It depends what they're looking for. I think to be realistic, there's a lot of lineages of classical yoga that don't really exist anymore, right? So, if we're talking about a textual lineage like the Yoga Sutras continue to be incredibly influential through the history of yoga, but it's not a clear lineage going back to Patanjali that's still teaching that, right? There's probably some here and there, like there's one commentary on the Yoga Sutras by Swami Hariharananda, for example. I think he still has a community. I forget where he is, but where he was, but that's hard to find in between there. And then like Hatha Yoga, to what degree it's still living is a little questionable, but there's certain yogic traditions where the medieval Hatha Yoga rather than modern Hatha Yoga. And then you have like, classical traditions like Advaita Vedanta or different Buddhist traditions, Tibetan Buddhist yoga, for example, has very strong lineages. And that his whole world is thriving and flourishing for various reasons, despite all the issues they've had and being in exile. I don't know. It's a good question. Like I can only really speak to Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, and I think there's several lineages that maintain the classical tradition. Which is, by the way, it's interesting that the majority of yoga people, when they think about yoga philosophy, they're thinking oneness, some form of oneness, whether interconnection, or they might not know the really distinction between oneness versus non-duality, like a stronger oneness. But there is this sort of generic idea that yoga is about uniting and coming to oneness. So it's actually a very Vedantic position, more broadly speaking, than what you'd find in the Yoga Sutras. But yeah, it's a tricky one, where to find and where to go. And I think the other problem is that it's also very difficult to find teachers who can translate for a Western audience. Because if you find someone in India, like let's say some monk, Swami, nun, Swamini, and their teaching style might be very different in general, from like an Indian pedagogical approach versus a more kind of engaged, open approach you'd find like in a modern university system here. Or it's so deeply intertwined with religious culture, which is beautiful. And some people love that. But then a lot of people, it's going to feel very othering and foreign. I think there's a healthy aspect to that. I think, just one little side note, I think in modern yoga, people just want to go into what feels really good to them. And that's sort of recreating their own wheel of spirituality. They're not often going to be confronted with a spirituality that's foreign, or they don't want to be, right? Because it's off-putting and alienating. And especially as a yoga teacher, you want that authority, right? You want that kind of ownership that I am embodying this tradition. So then you go to India or you go into a traditional context and you realize like, oh, this is very different than I thought, or I don't understand what's going on, or what do I do when I walk into a temple? What do I do in a puja, right? I can't just do whatever and there are yogis, Western, Caucasian yoga practitioners who are engaging in rituals, but they don't know how a puja is done in India necessarily. They're kind of recreating, just creating, right, their own kind of neo-pagan rituals in a kind of Hinduized context. But yeah, so there's also this problem of like teachers who can connect and sort of have a good vibe in pedagogical connection with the students and bring them into that world in a way that is not alienating. So I don't have a good answer.
I think that's a good answer. And because I think it's a good answer in just like the honesty of it. Because I feel like in the last couple of years as a South Asian yoga teacher, sometimes I get handed the mic of like, what do we do? And I'm just like, I don't know. Like 4 years ago, no one cared about me. Like all of a sudden now, like people are like, you're South Asian, you're a yoga teacher, we want you. And I'm just like, okay, like let me look into these things. And I found the best answer sometimes is just like, I don't know. And I'm just as much like trying to figure it out as everyone else is. And like, I deeply care, but that doesn't mean like, because I was born into the body of a South Asian woman and like also born and raised in North America, that I have the answers. It just means that in the last couple of years, people, some of it performative, like now want to be like, well, I'm associated with a South Asian yoga teacher, so we can continue like operating just as we are. And so I do appreciate just the honesty instead of being like, well, I think this, and this. Although at times, sometimes I do feel like I have to be like, well, you can do this, and this. And it's like a platform that is being shared and given. But sometimes it does feel a little performative from some of the organizations that do reach out to me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sea change that's happening. So, it's positive in many ways, right? That South Asian teachers are getting a voice, that they're being appreciated. We can be critical that it's like a token exchange, or it's, partly to demonstrate their own progressive wokeness, or, to change their status and get student, and there's that other side of it. But I think it's really fascinating to me that you have specifically like second generation South Asian diaspora, like me. I don't know about you, but my parents came from India, but I was born in the States. And so, as that first generation born and raised, or second generation, Indian American, when I go into a yoga studio, there's often this expectation that I know stuff. And that's weird, because if I didn't have my background, I would know nothing. Like prior to actually studying, like, okay, I was raised in a Hindu family. There's a certain level of comfort and understanding that comes with that, being exposed to different things, or reading, some texts or some narratives, Puranas or Mahabharata, or whatever. Like there's this and that, right? But I really didn't know much at all. And my parents in certain ways, like they've embodied it and they know so much. And then in other ways, they don't know anything. Like how to explain stuff. Like, why do we do this in a puja? I don't know. That's just the way we do it, Or, you say God's everywhere, but where is God? There's no everywhere, but everywhere how? Like, what does that mean everywhere? Why don't I perceive God in that way, right? Like, don't ask so many questions. Just, So it's a tricky thing. This new wave of South Asian teachers who are gaining a lot of sort of popularity or status or whatever it is, and many of them, their exposure is Western trainings, right? 200 hour, 500 hour, and maybe you say, okay, my grandparents taught me this and that, but and there are those grandparents that really know the tradition. But I think of most of our grandparents and our parents as holding religious culture seamlessly, like born and raised in it, knowing the holidays, knowing like what foods to make, and has so much knowledge that I still don't have. Like my mother knows way more about that stuff than I ever will. But they don't have yogic training. Or their yogic training is primarily just asana and pranayama as well. Like it was like gym class for them in high school or elementary school. And so they don't know what the Bhagavad Gita is really saying, or they'll refer to like Gandhi's or Tilak's or someone else's commentary, like a modern commentary. I'm like, no, I didn't realize it when I was younger. I'm like, that's a modern political commentary, which has very, very little to do actually with the classical tradition itself. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting position that South Asian teachers are being put into, and I think it's actually quite interesting for them specifically to find philosophy teachers, like living. When I say philosophy teacher, I don't mean just what does it say. I mean like the living tradition, because it's the whole idea is it's a communication, right? It's not just theory. It's a communication that opens one's eyes to these deeper understandings of yoga. So, yeah, it's an interesting world out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm glad that South Asian yoga teachers are finally being recognized and invited in, and I think there's a lot of positives to that. But I think there is still, like, it doesn't mean South Asian yoga teachers know everything. There's still like a lot of nuances there. So it's very much an interesting position to be in.
I'll just say, like, so when I stepped into traditional Advaita, it was pretty mind-blowing to see how vast and deep and complex it is on so many levels, textually, philosophically, in terms of practice, in terms of history, in terms of religious culture, the psychology of it. And so now I've dedicated the past 25 years or so, full time to this. And I still look to senior teachers, and I'm still mind blown, like that, what they know, and so I make a big distinction with traditional training. And we see this with all the Indian traditions, right? Like you can go into classical Indian music, or let's say some form of classical dance. And how long do you spend? Right? You want to study Bharatanatyam? What are you doing? 7 to 12 years? Not hobby time, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, or whatever, they're training. You're living it like an apprentice for all those years. And only then can you do your first public performance, right? So as your first to step into being like an expert in some sense. And you're still not an expert. And so I think it's so interesting to me. Like when I think about the Indian traditions, classical traditions, not just yoga, but broadly speaking, or you want to become someone who makes, let's say, that the stepatis who make the murtis, right, the deities for the temple, right? You'd have to apprentice that for so long, get everything just right, just the perfection and detail across the board is astounding. And if you think of the yoga traditions in many ways being the religious, epitome, like the highest level of practice and study, that everything else is actually geared towards. Like you can listen to classical music, and for example, there might be an amazing amount of Advaita Vedanta moving through or yoga philosophy moving through the music, in theory or in lyrics, or you listen to the mantras of a puja, so forth and so on. So, or looking at theater and dance and other things. So that level of study is really what necessary. And so I make this distinction that if someone doesn't have a traditional training, they're not. They might know a lot, but there's a distinct difference with what they can provide. It's not just what you know, it's learning pedagogical practices. So how do you teach? How do you communicate this up? How do you teach it? Like what order do you teach things in? How do you engage students in ways that bring them along into that knowledge? When you know to tell a student not to do something. I think there's a lot of, also when you get into the spiritual aspects of yoga, there's a lot of dangerous practices going on that I think are destabilizing individuals in many ways. So,
what are some of the dangerous practices that you're speaking of?
Broadly, one area is in like modern versions of tantra, like tantra, Kundalini practices, things of that sort, where I think just generically speaking, even in the classical traditions, there's all sorts of potential issues one falls into doing those practices. And so people approach it without proper guidance, and they might be doing something that's very they're calling tantra, which is not tantra, or maybe it's like sacred sexuality or something like that. Or maybe they're engaging in more traditional like tantra form, trying to awaken their Kundalini or something like that. And they have these experiences that might be profound or extraordinary, mystical, but then they're having migraines and insomnia, and they're feeling very ungrounded, and they can't focus, or they can't relate to people properly. Like, so there's things like that, or maybe not as dangerous in that way, but this hyper focus on meditation could be problematic. Trying to have like cessation of mind or some kind of samadhi. Right? So there's dark sides to that. Especially because people are engaging without understanding the philosophical context. So people think, I'm just going to meditate hardcore. I'll go to a retreat, for example, and I'll do meditation 8-10 hours a day for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And that's going to it might be profound. It may be incredibly painful and destabilizing. So just to give you an example, people experience something like derealization, which is a term for when the world starts seeming unreal, or de-individuation, where you start losing your sense of self. And in a context where there is no context, philosophical, I keep using the word philosophical, and it's not quite capturing, but like the living tradition of holding you and bringing you properly into those experiences, that's not there. An experience like derealization or de-individuation can be incredibly painful and frightening because you don't understand what's happening, right? People might not have prepared you for it. Like, like a Vipassana retreat, that can happen, right? And you have some minimal, interaction with some of the leaders, but they might not be trained they might just say, well, keep meditating, for example. And that might not be the right thing to do. Whereas if you were deep into understanding Buddhist theories of emptiness or Advaitin theories of non-duality or something like that, you might have a very different context for understanding that experience and how to hold it, how to process it, when to let go of it, or how, So, yeah, there's that. And then there's a lot of other stuff that I find problematic that's read as yogic, like the law of attraction, for example. And people thinking I'm just going to, make affirmations but end up pursuing, let's say, material ends or narcissistic ends or immoral ends. And so there's a lot of confusion coming there too, like of the lack of an ethical guideline underlying your practice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those examples. I know I have students reach out, and this has happened a number of times, asking me, I want to learn Kundalini yoga. Where can I go learn it? I'm just like, why don't you just start with yoga? Like, why do you need to hop straight into trying to awaken your Kundalini? And I never give recommendations, so I don't have any. I'm like, there's nothing I can refer you to. What I can refer you to is find a good just a good yoga teacher and start there instead of hopping straight into trying to awaken your Kundalini, and into those more, I don't know if I want to say extreme practices, but those practices that would require, I think, someone to be on the path for a long time and to have a teacher, and not needing it to be something you're not practicing at all. And all of a sudden you're just like interested in awakening your Kundalini. So go ahead.
I understand it's a natural place to go for yoga practitioners because for a couple of reasons. First off, if you look at the history of Hatha yoga in the medieval period, it's deeply tied to Kundalini and energetic practices, subtle body work. We call the physiological winds, the subtle winds. It's the same in Tibetan Buddhism, right? Vajrayana Buddhism, and of course, there's this whole interaction, cross-pollination, historical, tappings from Shaiva Tantra traditions, dealing with Kundalini and other kind of subtle energy stuff. And then modern yoga is so tied to the occult, at least certain communities, right? And so when you're looking at those American metaphysical traditions and the cult traditions or neo-pagan traditions, there's a lot of interactions, right, on these kind of energetic levels. And maybe additionally, there's this close interaction between energy healing now, like chakra work and Reiki and things which are modern phenomena. There's no chakra healing in the classical tradition. There's no attestate. You don't find that anywhere. And it's been totally revamped, in this modern period of psychologizing the chakras and other things like that. So if someone has these exposure to things like that, it's kind of natural. They're like, oh, Kundalini, this is it. And here's maybe going back to that idea of, if someone has the calling, they'll find it. Well, this might be an example where that potentially goes wrong, where someone has what we call mumukshutvam, this desire for liberation. We all have it, but someone has tapped into it in a way that they're seeing it more clearly. Now they're looking, and the most common thing you'll find in modern yoga on the spiritual occult side is Kundalini as a practice, right? Yoga Sutras and Bhagavad Gita are generally just taught in a very conceptual, pedantic manner. Like the Yoga Sutra said there's 8 limbs, yamas, niyamas, and so this is this and this is that, blah, blah, blah. Whereas now you can jump into Kundalini practices and you can actually go to a workshop. You can get a certification, right? You can go to the Yogi Bhajan's community, H3O, 3HO?
3HO.
Or something like that. Or, Siddha Yoga or something. There's some other communities that are teaching it. I'm not really in that world. Like, I don't know how to exactly judge what is authentic, to use that problematic term in itself, but what is traditional Tantra. I think historically the transmission of Tantra is pretty broken, coming out of Shaiva non-dual Tantra at least. So you have certain communities like, North India or in Bengal and, different Tantric communities, but I think it's very hard to find what is traditional Tantra. And it's completely been intertwined with like sacred sexuality and much more titillating forms of Tantra. So, and this is where the individual agency of modern spirituality becomes a problem. Because people think, I can just do this on my own. Like, I'll read a book on Tantra. I don't need a teacher. Like, I don't need someone to interpret the Bhagavad Gita. I don't need someone to explain to me, Tantric practice. And so I'll sit and, do these practices. And the thing is, if you don't believe in all this stuff, then I don't think you would bother doing it. If you do believe in it, enough to actually go to be disciplined about it, you should also recognize that it's got serious consequences. In the tradition, it's claimed there are serious consequences. Like the most important thing in Tantra is having a teacher. Right off the bat, right? There's no Tantra without a Tantric teacher. So, but even then, there's some recent literature discussing, critiquing the Yogi Bhajan group, for example. So, do they constitute that teacher or not?
Yeah, I did a 200-hour Kundalini yoga teacher training as taught by Yogi Bhajan back in 2019. And I found it to be, at that time it brought me back to Sikhism, so I'm thankful for that. But it was now in like the last couple months of doing research and seeing all the things, and those things started coming out maybe like a year after I'd finished my training, and just like how problematic and the abuse and hearing what Yogi Bhajan was doing, and also just the training itself. Like it's like different Hatha yoga techniques intertwined with Sikhism. So there are people that are chanting like Satnam Vaheguru. You close the class with Satnam. And I stopped practicing and I stopped teaching within a year. So I was just like, this just isn't sitting right with me. It doesn't feel, again, air quotes here, like authentic or real. And I stopped. I was like, this is just doesn't feel good to me. But I actually just went to a class yesterday, a Yoga Nidra class, and the teacher is a Kundalini yoga teacher, is taught by Yogi Bhajan. And so in her Yoga Nidra class, she's having us chant Satnam and do some other things. I was like, oh, I haven't done this in a while. And it was just interesting to come back in contact with that. But it is problematic.
Really interesting. There is a history of medieval Sikh yoga engaging, classical Hatha yoga practices. And classical Hatha yoga is really interesting because it's non-sectarian for the most part, right? So that you could be, Buddhists weren't really around in South Asia at the time, but you could be potentially Buddhist or Sikh or Hindu. But yeah, I guess this is not my area. I'm not doing any of this research, but I think, and I haven't read this in a while, but I think that the history is that Yogi Bhajan is his teacher. I'm forgetting his teacher's name, but sort of lifted it from his teacher and then like recoded it in Sikhism and, kind of created his own thing. And then there's the other issues, whatever scandals were involved in that history. But yeah, that's another point. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, but also Yoga Nidra itself is a modern phenomenon. So there's an article out by Jason, I think it's Jason Birch, wrote an article. It has elements of classical stuff but put together by who was the Shivananda's student who started the spacing the name was famous yoga center. And
Vivekananda?
no, this is later. It'll come to me.
Okay. Is it with a V? I don't know why.
Forgetting, it's in northeast India. If it's in Bengal or Orissa. But one of Swami Shivananda's students started it. There's also been there's a lot of good books they put out as well on like Tantra and the yoga. But the stories that, sorry, I'm forgetting. I'm sure I'll pop right into my mind.
You can email me after and I can put it in the show notes for folks that are interested.
I think Jason Birch has argued that he developed Yoga Nidra. And there are these elements of Yoga Nidra you can find earlier, but it's a distinctly modern phenomenon, the way they go through like, the body relaxation. That's not to dismiss its efficacy, right? Just because something's not classical doesn't mean it's better or worse or not effective. It's just that we live in this interesting world of yoga where everything is assumed to be old, like Surya Namaskar, the sequence, right? Or Yoga Nidra, or contemporary Kundalini practices. And much of it has elements of the past, but it's been reformatted for the present.
Yeah, that was one thing I was really shocked by when I was working on the book, where I just imagined that it was these yogis in caves doing sun salutations and the asana practices. And as I was doing my research, and I was like, oh, no, it isn't like that. But I feel like that's, even with years of study, I was like, whoa, it only took the last 8 months to realize that it wasn't, or actually taking your course. I was like, oh, it's actually not like that. But that's the understanding that I had for so many years. And it is very interesting.
I mean, we do think there were, by the medieval period where texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika were written, so let's say by the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, there does seem like there were yogic hermits, practicing asanas and various other kriyas and purification practices, by their hermitage, like in the forest. And so it's not that image is incorrect, or like that there is a sort of archetype of that yogic practice. And we don't really know how far back asana practice goes. There's a lot of, we have textual histories. And James Mallinson is the best known scholar really engaging this textual history. And I think, and we have some temple sculptures and other things we find. So it goes back, maybe 1,000 years. And it may go back a lot older. We just don't have a clear textual record for any complex asanas beyond different seated and prone postures. But it's quite possible that ascetics were developing various embodied practices like posture practice quite earlier. So, and it's always changing. There's a proliferation of asanas in the medieval period. And then into the modern period, many more, complicated asanas and different sequencing. And, there's some people think that there wasn't vinyasa kind of flow sequences, but then there's some evidence to suggest there was. So there's still a lot to be known about the history. I think it's a relatively young field. Really, so the majority of research has come out in the past 20 years. Like modern yoga, yoga wasn't a field of study. Postural yoga is a relatively new field of study in the academy. So there's still a lot to be done and figured out.
I have final question as we begin to wrap up. Is what is yoga's vision for human thriving, for human success or fulfillment? And how is that different from perhaps like our modern society or what capitalism thinks humans should be doing and thriving?
One way to think about this is there's a traditional way of very famous way of breaking down human pursuits to four major kind of types. So the first is artha, which is basic security. Right? So that could include financial security, like where to draw the lines is unclear, but some basic financial security, food, shelter, that kind of stuff. Maybe we include other things like having community and friendship and love, or having some level of self-respect or something. We can maybe add in more there. So security, then dharma, right? So your moral obligations, ethical, moral, social, ritual. There's kind of a world of different sort of obligations that you're supposed to fulfill for the good, for the greater good. And then there is desire, like what we call kama. Not any desire, like not so different desire than like desire to eat, to survive, but desires that are optional. I want a car, or I want this, or I want to buy this thing, or I want to have this experience. And so they say the majority of our life, we're working, everything we're pursuing is within those three in some way. It's reducible to those three in some way. And then we have this fourth, which is moksha. And that's really the yogic pursuit, is moksha. So I would say if you really want to, if a yoga practitioner really wants to think about, is my goal a yogic goal? The pursuit then is to parse out, why am I doing what I'm doing? And just because you're pursuing something which is explicitly yogic doesn't mean it's a yogic goal. So, for example, if I want to pursue posture practice and it's simply to be fit or beautiful or flexible, that's not really a yogic goal. That's a kama, right? That's a desire. It might be a healthy desire, but it's just a desire. Or I want to do yoga so that I'm able just to be able to move without pain. Maybe that comes under basic security or something like that. So, or to take something like something more on the esoteric side, like I want to do yoga to gain yogic powers, like what we call the siddhis, right? I'm going to develop this ability to read people's auras and chakras. There's no word for aura in Indian context, I'm aware of. But this sort of idea, right? So now you have to ask, well, why? Am I doing that as a yogic practice? Or am I doing that because I want power? Right? And power would be a different goal. The goal of yoga, and some scholars might say the goal of yoga is power, but I don't read it that way. That's a very reductive kind of functionalist reading. So if we say moksha is the goal of yoga, of course, there's going to be different ideas of what moksha is, what is freedom, liberation. But to me, it has to be instrumental to that in some way, to be a yogic goal from a classical standpoint.
Yeah, sometimes the question I think of here in terms of like capitalism is like, when is enough enough? And this like constant seeking and desiring, and how to kind of like rein it back in. Because when I think about capitalism, sometimes just like rampant material consumerism. What would yoga have to say about that?
And for the most part, yoga is going to be incredibly critical. I mean, hugely critical. We could find exceptions, but I think the bulk of classical yoga is going to be hugely critical of engaging capitalism with the clinging involved of the ways we engage capitalism, right? There's like having a material, there's a lot capitalism is complicated. and it is sort of a distinctly modern phenomenon in ways we think of capitalism now. But even just, let's say, just talk about materialism, whether it's physical materialism, like the pursuit of physical things, or the pursuit of power, or the pursuit of respect, or status, obviously wealth is the big one. And yoga is, by and large, dedicated to an ascetic worldview. Letting go. It's not that you necessarily have to actually get rid of your possessions, but that you shouldn't have attachment to your possessions. Right? So attachment is the getting and the holding. Actually, another word for yoga is the in a critical way. Yoga is the acquiring of something, right? That kind of union. And then the maintenance to sustain that acquisition, which is called kshema. So yoga and kshema. And that is a form of suffering, right? So seeking to acquire something, there's suffering involved in trying to get something, right? Because you've already projected your happiness onto the goal, onto the object or this experience or the power or whatever it is. And then everything becomes either an ally or adversary in the process of attaining that. Right? So now everyone's either they're good or bad. And if you get it, you're happy for a little bit, but then you become sad because it loses its shine, or whatever you get gets diminished or damaged, or you're fearing how are you going to hold on to it, right? Like a politician getting in power. Now they have to hold their power. It's very stressful. It's another cause of suffering. Or you don't get it in the first place, and now you've failed and you're suffering, right? So across the worlds of yoga, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., Jain, Sikh, this idea of this sort of twofold aspect of raga, dvesha, like the craving for something to get, or the craving to get rid of something you're averse to, like that aversion, is the cause of our suffering. Failure, frustration, anger, hatred when someone's getting in the way of what you want. And so from that level, it's not, yoga's not necessarily saying you shouldn't pursue anything, but that there's a possibility to pursue things with equanimity. A lot of pursuits would fall away if you're not projecting your happiness onto the outcome in the first place, the situation, intended situation. Some things would remain to pursue, but then you don't have to be attached. So when you don't get it, you're not suffering. And in the wake of that, I think, this whole importance of morality and ethics in the yogic path flows from that. In part because in two directions, so bi-directional flow. So first, engaging moral pursuits, or let's say altruism, compassion, benevolence, non-harming, ahimsa, is going to clear your mind. Right? It puts you in a mental dispositional state that is healthier for any yogic pursuit, right? And for being in the world and relating to people. And of course, karmically, it's good for you too. And then the more you understand, the more wisdom. I mean, yoga is wisdom, right? So the more wisdom you have, and the less you're projecting your happiness onto particular outcomes and not trying to control the world to bend to your will in that way, the more that ethical freedom will take place as well, right? So you actually have it's a mutually collaborative, reciprocal kind of practice that you gain more wisdom, you become freer in the world, you gain more capacity to be moral, to be loving, to be compassionate, etc. And that cycles itself. So it's like shifting that whole trajectory. And capitalism, materialism, consumption falls away in that process, right? It loses its value. And so to whatever degree modern yogis or modern spirituality is engaging in a consumeristic endeavor, to that degree, it's in conflict with the classical traditions.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that wisdom. Because as you were sharing, I was thinking about my own experience with yesterday getting that email saying you no longer have this teaching engagement, and that sense of like, what does this mean? And why did they give me enough notice? And just like all the different things that were coming up around that, and allowing myself to be with it with equanimity, and letting that be something that's just happening, and not having to have so much attachment around it. Because I know I've definitely in different parts of my life have done that projected happiness onto a goal and thought, as soon as I get there, then like I've acquired it, I've done it. And it's taken a lot of work to get to a place to not do that. And it doesn't mean I'm just like sitting around not doing anything. I'm still working towards things. But there is more of a balance and wisdom around it. And I think that understanding around the desires and the aversions is really important to understand that natural inclination that we all have, that our mind has. It's powerful to understand. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the core teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, for example. It's like, how do you accept a situation that didn't go your way? And you actually have a choice, a wise choice. You know, it requires practice and understanding, and it's a yogic practice, right, of developing that equanimity. And it's set in a particular teaching, and an understanding of a whole other thing that kind of comes in here, which is maybe a bigger discussion too, is like the role of Ishvara in all of this. Like a good English translation is something like the divine, God, doesn't quite work in translation. That's also, you know, so central to the Hindu Brahmanical yogic traditions, at least. And in many ways, also in the Buddhist yoga traditions, in a different way. And that's often lost too. But in any case, yeah, it's you know, cheerful equanimity. And equanimity is not caring. Right? It's not about disassociation and disengagement or fatalism. It's the holding the seeming paradox of being able to care and pursue things and yet not be attached at the same time. And that's, yeah, it's a beautiful thing because it's incredibly freeing. And I forget the example you gave earlier, but in my mind, then something similar to what you said, which I can't remember now. It's like in the beginning, it's like carving something into stone. And so when something happens to us, you know, it's like holding a grudge forever, as long as the stone lasts. And then the wiser and wiser you get, the shorter that time period becomes. Like drawing in sand, and the tide's going to come and sweep it away. And eventually it's like drawing in the water, where it doesn't leave a mark in terms of the pain. And that's really the mark of a liberated person, is that they're able to handle situations in that way. Same in the Yoga Sutra, like this idea of santosha. It's not just contentedness, it's contentedness in failure too. Yeah, it's really, there's a whole philosophy of happiness moving through these traditions that's incredibly profound.
Yeah, and creating space to be able to touch into the joy of being alive, which I wasn't necessarily taught any of that. And then being able to, through these teachings, be taught and realize that there is this inner joy and contentment that can arise and be present at any point, at any moment, and any time. Does allow for when things go wrong, and they go wrong all the time, to be like, okay, I'm going to feel all the things that are coming up, but also it's going to be okay. Like, I can move and handle this situation. And as someone who used to struggle with anxiety a lot, it's allowed me to be with my anxiety, to be like, when that situation happens, we'll deal with it at that point. Like, worrying about something that might or might not happen in the future isn't really a wise way of being in the present moment. But now that I, through my practices, have the strength and the resilience of like, well, if something wrong does happen at that point, we can deal with it. And it'll be fine. It'll be fine at that point too. But without these teachings, I probably would still be a very anxious, angry mess.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things about let me just specify to Advaita Vedanta, because I'll speak about this, is that it's totally reframing our understanding of happiness. So instead of thinking I'm a limited person and or I'm a lacking person and I need to get this in order to diminish, to fill my lack and get to a non-lacking state, the idea is that we're already full. We're already complete. We have innate happiness. And the happiness is not a state of mind. It's not a mental state. It's one's very being. The ground of our being is complete and full. And it's only because of an error that we keep mistaking ourselves as limited. And the error is causing us to pursue things to complete us and fulfill us. And so the whole solution has nothing to do with fulfillment based on attaining things through actions and results, gaining or reaching or whatever. Rather, it's coming to an understanding of that fullness. So it also shifts the whole yogic pursuit, not from one of just doing stuff to get something or get somewhere, or to transform myself from limited to unlimited, like the caterpillar to the butterfly idea. But rather, it's just stripping away the errors and seeing, oh, I actually am whole. I've just been erroneously delimiting that wholeness based on an error, right? So for me, the yogic, there's all sorts of practices, whether it's posture or meditation, other things. But the real core of yoga is a knowledge-based practice of eliminating my error about myself by recognizing myself as whole. And then once you recognize yourself as whole, it greatly or ultimately completely dismisses or eliminates this sort of the craving, because you can crave things, but you can also recognize like, I don't need this to be whole because I am whole, right? So it becomes a very different process.
Yeah, becomes a very different way of being with life.
Just going back to the glasses on the head. We don't want to be a yoga practitioner that has their glasses on their head that's searching everywhere. Glasses. And whether you're searching from like a materialistic point of view or you're doing spiritual practices that are really like sattvic and wholesome, you're still not going to find your glasses that way until someone points it out to you, or you realize that you have your glasses. And then all that searching falls away. It's like, well, why was I running here and there trying to figure it out when the solution was already here? So it's a totally radical reframing. And I think this, there's this trope that happiness is within. It's trite, and people say that, but where is it that you need the yogic path to realize that, and to shift from this perspective, at least to shift from thinking I'm going from point A, my yogic path, to point B. Really, we're just coming back to point A. But if we don't see it that way, it's like chasing the horizon. You're just going to keep chasing. And the chase can be fun. And there can be a lot of growth in the chase, but it's not going to end. It can't end. There's no solution there to chasing them.
Yeah, I'm just like sitting with all of this. So I know for me, it's always just such beautiful teachings, but also reminders to just keep coming back to myself instead of that like searching and like seeking outside of myself. And I know I could talk to you for like another 2 to 3 hours easily, but I want to be mindful of your time. So as we wrap up this episode, is there any last things that you would like to share?
No, just to add one thing on that line, like I think the most important thing in yoga is inverting your gaze and sort of looking back through the layers of mind. Mm-hmm. This takes guidance. It's not a simple practice, but really, if you think of it this differently that way, like how can I see the ground of my mind? Like, how do I see the foundation of my experience? You know, I have, like in asana practice, we're so engaged in our physical perception, tactile sensation, and our kinesthetic sense of being in space and so forth and so on. But what about like on the emotional level, or on the basic perceptual level, going back in, or what about like higher order cognition, metacognition? How do I know that I'm aware of something? And so really what yoga is doing is we're finding that ground. Whether it's the Yoga Sutras, people, I'll just say, people always want to quote the second Yoga Sutra, that yoga is a cessation of mind. But it's really the next sutra that's just as or more important, which is that when you have cessation of mind, then the witness, the seer, stands in its own nature. So what is that seer? What is that witness? What is that center point of awareness? And that's, to me, that inquiry, that self-inquiry is the solution of where one's happiness is. So something to think about and to try and engage.
I think that's a wonderful place of inquiry, and a great place for folks as they're listening to this to turn to, and also turn as a practice themselves. So I'm so thankful that you, as we wrap up the episode, like brought that to the light. And hopefully that's something that people as they listen, or students, can actually turn to and start to explore for themselves. This has been so wonderful speaking to you for the last hour and a half, 2 hours, kind of moving all over the place. And through all of this, like, I know I just had so many nuggets of wisdom that came to me from you, and having this conversation where there are layers of intricacies. It's not just an easy, like, yes, do that, don't do that. And knowing that this path takes years and potentially lifetimes of study, so there's no rush. And finding a good teacher is important. So, Neil, I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that you said yes, that I get to study with you. And then for this really impactful conversation, I'm just like full of gratitude. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
And to everyone that tuned in, thank you so much. I'll see y'all for the next episode. Bye. Thank you for being a part of this journey. If today's episode resonated with you, please share it with your community, and let's keep this conversation going. You can connect with me on Instagram at Harpinder Man Yoga, and you can also dive deeper with my book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. If you're based in SoCal, I lovingly invite you to come to my book launch celebration on June 25th at the Peter Performance Space. We'll have meditative asana led by me. There will be kirtan. There's going to be ecstatic dance. All things that allow me to experience freedom and liberation. And I would love to share them with you. Until next time, keep practicing with intention and integrity. This is Liberating Yoga, where we honor yoga's past and shape its future. Until next time, bye.